Hi, Elma. How are
I can be anywhere. I can sit here.
It's gentlemen. What's Leo? Leo.
We have a conference. Yeah. Which is around here. Yeah.
Leo.
11 to 1:30.
Good morning, everyone.
That's all. I don't want to miss it.
I'm Joseph Gildenhorn, chairman of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and let me welcome you here this morning. My wife, Alma, who is here today, and I were very pleased to start the Joseph and Alma Gildenhorn Middle East Forum at the Wilson Center back in 2004. And it was established to explore the opportunities and means for the resolution of regional conflict, including, but not limited to, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today's meeting is moderated by Robert Malley, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at the International Crisis Group, and Aaron David Miller, a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. It is the second in a series of 4 sessions designed to examine the changing dynamics in the Middle East, with specific reference to the Arab-Israeli conflict. The first session, which many of you attended last October, discussed the Palestinians and their politics, and this morning's event will focus on the Israelis and their political situation. Our session today could not be more timely. Last week, the party of Avigdor Lieberman withdrew from the coalition, and tomorrow the much-anticipated final report of the Winograd Committee investigating the responsibilities for the 2006 Lebanon War is due to be published. And of course, these developments are taking place against the backdrop of both a bitter confrontation between Israel and Hamas, as well as a potentially important peacemaking effort between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, a process which was launched in Annapolis late last year. Clearly, to understand the issues of what lies ahead for Arab-Israeli peacemaking, it is vital to examine, both objectively and candidly, the political landscape of the key participants. Israel is a very vibrant democracy, but its politics can be very complex and opaque. And we must ask ourselves, what are the political constraints on decision-making, and how will they affect the options for the sitting Israeli Prime Minister, Yehuda Meir, as well as his rivals, both inside and outside of the government? I am confident that today's sessions will leave all of us with a better and a clearer understanding of the Israeli political environment. I would now like to turn the program over to my good friend and a public policy scholar here at the Center, Aaron David Miller. And I'd like to note that Aaron's new book will be published by Bantam Dell in March, and is entitled The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. Aaron, we wish you much success on your new book, and we turn the rostrum over to you. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming on this wet, rainy morning. Henry Kissinger once observed, probably in a moment of great frustration, that Israel had no foreign policy, it just had domestic politics. It's an exaggeration, to be sure. Democracies, non-democratic polities, all have domestic politics. But in the case of Israel, the line between foreign policy and domestic politics is very often a seamless one, in large part because you're dealing with a large country, a small country in a dangerous neighborhood, making big decisions with small parties involved in a very complex coalition. And there's a certain dynamism that is produced. MERHAV last year noted that since 1948, Israel has had 31 governments. Only 2 of those governments have actually gone to term. And as we look at the post-Annapolis situation over the next year, domestic politics will not be very far from the surface as the government of Israel tries to make peace with part of the Palestinian House and to deal in a more aggressive manner with the other part. I can think of no better observers and participants to begin to explain the complexities of this situation than our 3 presenters here today. You have their bios. I would only say this about them. All of them have had other lives before they got involved in politics. And I think that's extremely important in life. It adds a certain perspective and a richness to one's view of the world. All, at the same time, have provided advice to sitting Israeli prime ministers over time. Labor prime ministers, Likud prime ministers. In the case of Dov Weissglass, a representative of Kadima. So we've covered the political spectrum. And finally, all are no longer in government. And I would argue that they are now freed from the constraints that they were once under, and I will encourage them, with a very large hint, to speak very openly, frankly, and honestly about the Israelis and their politics. So with that in mind, let's begin with Dov Weissglass. Dov?
I can do it from here.
Where you want.
Israeli governments generally are weak because they are based on a population, people who came from 88 different countries with a relatively very short tradition of political life, of democratic life, less than 60 years, who are carrying on a variety of opinions and perceptions and traumas and past experiences of any possible kind. The level or the degree of national consensus in Israel is so low. The public debate, the public dispute starts with what is desirable percentage of fat in milk, and what should be the boundaries of the countries, what should be relationship between state and religion, some other trivial issues. So if we look into the old existing democracies, like the European, so in the United Kingdom, I think the socio-politically people had agreed about the form, the structure, the political structure of the British Kingdom maybe about 500 years ago. All the rest, along the histories, is dealing with details. Details can be very dramatic, but still details. We are one of the few places of a country without a constitution, without known boundaries, that its life are constantly threatened by certain psychos who happen to live in the same region, and with a very low degree of internal agreement or consensus. So on the basis of such promising facts, no wonder that within 60 or 31st government has been changed. I would expect it to be a number much higher than that. So as I say, so axiomatically, we have a weak government. Now, the weakness of our government, and now let's go into the current context, of course, has to be measured in a relative context, which is the weakness of our counterparties, of the Palestinians. When a weak government deals with a strong government, and both leaders would like to get somewhere, it's normally, we say, it's a strong leader who is borrowing part of his capabilities, of her heroism, of his public standing into his weaker partner. Namely, he can be more far-reaching in his offers, he can be more daring, he can be more generous. A meeting between two leaders, that each and one of them politically is hardly alive, ends up with a demonstration of radicalism and extremism and full obedience into public moods and so forth, even if the two people themselves definitely think differently. And this is also the case of the current dialogue between Mr. Olmert and Mr. Abu Mazen, two people that from a personal standpoint are excellent people, two people who do believe in the need for peace, or at least significant progress towards peace, but both are so constrained and bound by their domestic obligation. Prime Minister Sharon, which I had the historic privilege to be next to him in the last 4 years of his terms, and from 2002 until his sickness in 2006. And again, I don't know to tell why, but it's a different magnitude, it's a different generation. He's somebody who was maybe the last of the, those traditional founding fathers.
I remember that in one of these very many discussions we had with the military, in one of these meetings with the military, it was a whole bunch of high-ranked military officials that were very, very strongly against something that he proposed, or maybe the other way around, that they proposed something he was very much against. So the discussion, the debate went on and on and on, and finally, all of a sudden, he looked at them and he said, you know, guys, what you remind me is almost a similar discussion we had at 1955, at the eve of the Sinai War. I remember it was late afternoon at Ben Gurion's house, and Moshe Dayan said that, and I don't remember, and Asaf Simchoni said this and that, and I said to Moshe Dayan. Then there was a little pause, and I don't remember what happened. Some people had some phone calls, so we left the room, and Dan Chalutz, then the Deputy Chief of Staff, told me, you see, that was the end of discussion. I said, what does it mean, the end of discussion? You see, he said, in his very sophisticated manner, it's a way to transmit to us, now guys, just shut up, because when I dealt with issues of this kind, most of you were not in existence, and you, Mr. Chalutz, who was the older in the group, you was 4 years old. So that's it. And almost naturally, when we came back to the room, the discussion went into a different topic, like never happened before. So that was a way to bring an end, as I said, to a difference of opinion, simply by this very casual, elegant transmission. Well, I've been here 40 years before everybody here was born. I'm doing the same stuff. But this is gone. It's not now. Also, so he managed in these 4 very stormy years of disengagement and the other quite difficult political challenges we went through, to manage his way with support of 30% of the parliament, support of, Yehuda, I will not say 70%, but 60%. Yehuda corrected me in the morning. Support of 60% of the public, and his party Likud completely torn, but yet he managed to create actually 3 different compositions of coalition. We had one coalition for economic and social affairs, that the composition of the supporters was one coalition for the political process that was second, and how it worked. But that was it was a very unique, to a very unique person. It's non-existence today. So as I say, so today we have 2 leaders who are dramatically bound by their domestic political obligation. When it comes to our other side is the Vinegar report, which is expected to be published tomorrow. There is no question will weaken this government as significantly more. And I don't know whether you follow the ongoing debate about it. What will be the language? What kind of words they're going to use? This is not really important. It is a government who is publicly perceived as bearing a responsibility to a war which didn't succeed, if I'll put it mildly. If we'll go into our very short history, Israeli public opinion never gave up, it was never forgiven to a government that somehow misfunctioned in what is considered to be maybe the ultimate role of responsibility of Israeli government, which is security and war. So no matter how it will end, I'm not sure it will end. It will bring about an immediate collapse of this government, but it will be a process that may take between 6 to 9 months. Altogether, most of the political evaluation in Israel that election will be scheduled either by the end of this year, early next year, one way or the other, a year of an election in this country as well as a year of an election in this country, maybe to a lesser degree, is a lost year in terms of attempt to have any progress. As if it was rightly said, or it was rightly Kissinger was quoted about the fact that Israel has no foreign relations, there's no external policy, it's only internal policy. So our tendency to put our internal policy on top of everything else, of course, is intensified in election time. Everything is a campaign. Nothing will happen. On the other side, as I said, it is not that our Palestinian neighbors or partners help us. The disintegration, the radicalization, also this impossible relationship between Hamas and Fatah, also cornered their leader also into a very radical position. In the first place, whenever we talk with the Palestinians, so the question, who is the Palestinian now? If the Palestinians would have to ask their attorney to issue, we call it a certificate of a signatory rights, like the stuff you take to the bank before you open a bank account, who is having the signatory right? The Palestinian Authority, very rightly, is unwilling to give up Gaza as an integral part of the Palestinian state to be. Gaza is unwilling to participate in this game. Gaza is totally controlled by Hamas. The lesson and the message that is broadcasted by Gaza is critically unhelpful. In a very discreet talks we had with Palestinians before this engagement, we said that though it's a unilateral step, but what does it mean unilateral? I mean, what's unilateral? We will withdraw from Gaza up to the last inch. We will take those old good maps drawn by the end of World War I to find where the international borders between Palestine then and Gaza are, and that's where we're going to be. We will not leave an inch which is not ours, just for, to remove any possible doubt, not to recreate a Shaba problem for the second time. And you guys will take over the area. You guys will be there just by your own. No Israelis around. And please show, primarily to yourself, but also to the world, and to ourselves, what Palestinians can do with themselves when they become fully responsible, when they have the Israeli tanks in front of their eyes when they wake up in the morning. And unfortunately, situation in Gaza developed into a mess that I don't think there is need to continue. All the arrangements we entered with the United States, with the European Union, with the European cops, with the UN inspectors about Rafah as a passage, as a crossing that ought to be handled for the first time without Israeli involvement, totally failed. The situation in Gaza is of the kind, how should I say it, that I just heard from a Palestinian journalist a few weeks ago, that when these massive, uncontrolled exchange of fire in Gaza streets went between Hamas people and Fatah people, and so many unrelated people were hurt. So Palestinian mothers explained to kids that they shouldn't leave home, naturally. And they told them the only time you may leave home when you hear above the Israeli helicopters. Because the sound of the approaching Israeli helicopter means that the armed gangsters are clearing the streets. So the part of the Middle Eastern absurd. So if Mr. Abu Mazen is about to enter into agreement, on whose behalf? What's the extension of his proxy? I mean, Gaza is in, Gaza is out. Secondly, the law enforcement in the West Bank also in a very, very warning degree. It is true that the work which is done now by Palestinians is by far better than in the past. But a relative progress is not enough. We need an absolute progress. We are very worried. For just one example, if you follow the news, just about 3 weeks ago, 3 Israeli kids, I think in 19, lived in one of the settlements in the area of Hebron, walked in one of the wadis in the area. It was Saturday afternoon. They were dressed, the two of them were soldiers, was on off duty. They were dressed in their civic clothes. They were armed, but it was clearly they were walking with a girl. They were ambushed and killed by two Palestinian policemen. The girl managed to escape. The other two were killed. But the testimony of the girl, of course, helped our security service to identify the killers, who, as I said, were two police. And so the killers instantly turned themselves into the hands of the Palestinian police because they knew that the alternative is much worse. They were taken into court in Jericho and were sentenced for 15 years. Now, 15 years, I don't know where this number came from. It was a cold-blooded, intended murder of two innocent walkers, though if these walkers were settlers. There couldn't be a mistake who they are and what the circumstance. So this figure 15 reflects this duality between some people who believe that those poor policemen have done nothing, and those people who believe that whatever they have done, it needs a certain manifestation of sanction, otherwise the world will be angry. So the inner compromise is a number of 15, which is not too bad in terms of possible commutation of punishment, which may turn it down to 7 or 8. But it's a number which is enough to keep people's mouths shut. I don't know. That very some troubling, because this is not a case where an action of terrorism is not taken care of by the Palestinians, which, by the way, which is the vast majority of cases. This is a case that were so-called properly taken care of by the Palestinians. So the inability or the unwillingness, or maybe both, of Palestinians to provide Israel with security, this is the axiomatic obstacle at the present time for any progress. Most of the Israelis would like to see the Israelis and the Palestinians living side by side, of course with peace, but since everybody is skeptical about the peace, but for sure with security. With security. The roadmap and President Bush address of June 2002 was received in Israel in a hilarious way, but always bear in mind the fact that the Israeli government about a year later adopted the roadmap, the fact that President Bush's letter to Sharon on April 14, 2004 was received almost as a national victory is true. It's not because 10% of the West Bank would remain in the hands of Israel. It's also because 90% of the West Bank were owed to be delivered to the Palestinians to be a basis for their land. It was the Israeli government and it was the Israeli public who really reacted enthusiastically to this letter and reflected his full agreement to the fact that 90% of the West Bank will become a Palestinian state. In other words, which clearly indicates that these many thousand years of Israeli dream of a country from the land, from the sea to the river, from the river to the sea, is gone. There is almost total consensus in Israel that a Palestinian state is a fact. That is also consensus in Israel that a Palestinian state means a state which is contiguous, which is viable, which has normal configuration, I mean size-wise, and it will be there side by side to Israel. So in terms of minds of the people, or in terms of the mindset of the people, a lot has been gained in the last 4 years, primarily due to the support and to my, at least to my opinion, to the very, very carefully, well-educated work done by the U.S. administration. So, so I don't think now that the split of the territory is the major issue. It's not even might be issue at all. Again, there always will be in the margins people who are willing to kill and to be killed. But altogether, when it comes to the majority of the people, there is the consensus. The only reason it is not implemented, and apparently cannot be implemented, it's security. Now, for as much as within Israel, some of what known as some painful decisions like the redivision of Jerusalem to a certain degree, to give up part of the West Bank are painful, very painful decisions that can be delivered only by a strong leadership. Also, on the other side, to impose law and order, to enforce law, to prevent terrorism, also needs very strong leadership on the other side. In the absence of strong leadership, the precondition, the basic precondition for any further progress are not there yet. And the event we are expecting tomorrow is, how should I say it? It's an additional bang, which might be a big one, but it's not necessarily important, into a structure that by itself is quite weak. Thank you.
Yehuda?
You'll help me work it here? I'd appreciate it. Good morning to everyone. As Aaron said, Israeli politics evidently seems quite confusing to some of the observer from abroad. This is probably true, and indeed complex, but you know, and people in Israel find it also hard to understand American politics following all these primaries from state to state, and why Iowa is so important. They don't even know where Iowa is, something like that. But okay, can you help me out there? Just which tables I want to see and move it forward. The ability. Where am I here?
Yeah.
I don't want to show it yet. So when I want to show it, what do I do? Don't put it on yet. Put it off. Okay, and then I'll start moving it. Okay, so maybe I'm okay. The ability for any government to implement any policy, and certainly an agreement, depends on two tracks. The first one is the formal political one, and the second is that of public opinion. And although the two are not identical, they are certainly closely related. And Mr. Weisglas spoke before more or less on the political track. The political track pertains, of course, to the ability of a government, first of all, to maintain a majority in the Knesset in order to ensure its continued existence, because at any time in the Knesset, any party can bring a motion of no confidence and the government can fall. So first of all, it has to maintain its own existence. And second, to attain a majority in the Knesset in support of any agreement which the government reaches, if it reaches, and of course needs the support of a majority in the Knesset. No agreement evidently can be implemented without the support of a majority in the Knesset. I myself has been a member of the Knesset for many years, and one of my friends would ask me, what do you need in order to be a member of the Knesset? What are the qualifications that you need? I used to answer them, the only qualification you need is one. You have to know how to count to 61. Because if you know how to count to 61, then you know you have a majority. Now, it may seem simple to count to 61. I know of a lot of people who don't know how to count to 61, and they get wrong. They think they had 61, they end up with 58, which is not the same. And as Nimrod, my friend Nimrod reminded me, Mr. Shimon Peres used to always tell his disciples, mainly Yossi Balin, maybe Nimrod also, he always used to remind them of a very important fact, which is that in a democracy, it's not enough to be right, you also have to have a majority. Mr. Balin evidently did not internalize this piece of advice, and that's why Shimon Peres is where he is and Yossi Balin is where he is.
You're right, but he had an answer, and he said, in a democracy,
Leaders should create it. That's what I'm going to come to.
It's not the role of the leader to create the majority rather than follow it.
That's what I'm going to come to right away. At times, astute political leaders can maintain their governments and even push through policies and maintain those policies, although they do not enjoy the support of public opinion. A contrary example, by the way, is, as Mr. Weissglass said, Arik Sharon enjoyed the support of public opinion in the question of the disengagement. But in some cases, astute political leaders can continue to rule and pursue policies, even though when you look at the polls, they don't necessarily enjoy public support. Perhaps the best example is President Bush, who is nevertheless pushing through a policy which, according at least to the polls in Iraq, doesn't necessarily enjoy the process. Ariel Sharon was a genius in political acrobatics, that is true. And as Mr. Weissglass said, he formed two different coalitions in the same Knesset. One coalition kept the government alive, and the other coalition put the disengagement through, although the two never met, etc. Mr. Olmert, by the way, and I must in the good sense and responsibility of full disclosure say that I'm a good friend of Mr. Olmert. I think he also has a great political genius in political acrobatics. He's an astute politician and also has formed coalitions and kept the government alive for a year, even though many, many people predicted its demise much earlier. But, and this is the main point of my presentation today, in the final analysis, and giving in a democracy, no political party and no political leader can ignore for long the exigencies and the realities of public opinion. He can try to form public opinion, and governments do form public opinion, and political leaders can form public opinion, and we have many examples, both in the United States, going back all the way to Franklin Delano Roosevelt versus isolationism, and in Israel. Oslo and disengagement, which I'll come to right away. But there are, of course, limits. So what can we say regarding Israeli public opinion today, which is a key constraint, of course, beyond the specific political constraints, beyond the politics of Lieberman or Shas, beyond that magic number of 61 that you have to keep it going, to keep the government going, and to get 61, they don't have to be the same. That's true. To get 61 to support an agreement, let's say if you reach, as President Bush said last night, by the end of 2008, and bring it to the Knesset and get that number.
Yehuda, maybe it would be important just to draw the attention of our friends around here that in the last 2 years there is a very critical change of the law regarding a motion of non-confidence.
I know, it needs alternative prime minister.
It's not enough to have 61 voting against the government, but also the opposition must collect 61 who support an alternative government.
Yeah, well, that normally never happens. What you would get is 61 calling for new elections.
That gives a government an enormous power of survivorship, even if they lost the the arithmetical majority.
But I don't want to go into the specific details as yet, as we can have a long discussion on the complexities of Israel's political system and how you can have 61 if you don't have 61, etc. But I want to go talk about public opinion. What is Israeli public opinion? Where does it stand regarding the key issues? Because in the final analysis, even Mr. Sharon, with all his prestige, and there is no one in the Israeli public scene today that has the prestige either of Mr. Sharon or of Yitzhak Rabin, and for reasons that I think Mr. Weissglass explained, because of their prestige as Mr. Security, each of them. But even Sharon needed a majority of the public, at least the public support for his policy. So what can we say in 10 minutes on Israeli public opinion? It's a very difficult task to do. I've dealt with this a long time. And first of all, before I go into, I want to mention 3 features. And if we only have one time, I'll mention maybe just one and elaborate on a little. And if we have time, I think there are 3 key features in order to understand in depth Israeli public opinion. But the first thing, beyond all the features, is the complexity of Israeli public opinion. I imagine public opinion is complex in every country. It's certainly very complex in Israel. So if you see one question and they say here 60% are in favor of disengagement, or 70%, or 50%, it doesn't really mean that much in and of itself. Because I'll ask a different question, slightly different, and I'll get you 50% in the other way. Now, we run, where I work in the INSS, Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. We have a project, NSPOP, National Security Public Opinion Project, for the past 20 years. Every year we run in-depth studies. We ask almost 100 questions, face-to-face interviews. And when you look at the results, someone who is not aware of public opinion and the science involved in it and the understanding of it, then he can reach one of two conclusions. Or the people didn't tell the truth, or the interviews faked the interview, or they're all stupid, or something doesn't make sense, because how can you have such different answers in the same thing? The answer is you can have it. You can have it even in the mind of one person. In the mind of one person, each public opinion is complex, certainly when you take a whole country. So public opinion is very complex. But I want to name three features. I think the first most important feature, and I think that Dubi Vaiskas mentioned it passing by, and I can bring, I think, the numbers to substantiate it, is the strength of the center in Israel. If you ask me, I think that perhaps the secret, or one of the secrets, of Israel's survival over the past 60 years, wars, intifada, all the problems that they have, is, surprisingly enough, I as a religious person can say there's maybe a little miracle involved in this, but someone who doesn't can say it's a matter of nature. The Israeli center, throughout all of it, remains strong. And the tendency to extremism, which of course receives tremendous coverage in the media, as in every country, is totally exaggerated in terms of what it reflects. Now, when we did this study, normally when you see studies in Israel, of course, you see the percentages, the numbers, how many in favor of this and how many in favor of this, every Friday probably in the newspaper. We wanted to do a more in-depth study, and we wanted to see, to try to take we had a sample of 700 people, give or take, 724, 709, a representative sample of the adult Jewish population in Israel. Mainly for technical reasons, we did not poll the Arab population, which from the voting age is 15%. Around 20%, 21% of Israeli citizens are Israeli Arabs, but because of the difference in the birth rate, many of them are youngsters. So if you take your voting age adult population, 18 and above, you have around 85% Jewish, 15%. So this is relating to the Jewish population of Israel. We decided, let's try to make a profile. Let's try to see, instead of giving percentages, to make profiles. Can you give me the first one now? Yeah, okay, put it on the first one now. Let's try to take these 700 people and divide them into profiles. So let's say we wanted to take 4 profiles: extreme right, moderate right, extreme left, moderate left, and the center. And let's see what we got. So we took out of, I say, like almost 90 questions plus. It worked before. And we had here, just to put it on so it should be easy.
Murphy was an optimist.
Oh, it's coming on now. Don't feel bad. I've been in many military presentations like this. Everything goes good, but when they start working the computer. We got Windows now here. Bob, this is off my time, though. It's not
Just discussing that.
It's shut down. I think there's something wrong with my plug there.
Okay, you try to work on it, and I'll talk on it ahead here. So we asked a number of questions, just to give you an example. Territory should be returned for peace. Okay, on a 1 to 7 scale, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Okay, so someone who, of course, strongly agrees would be extreme left. 5 and 6 on that 1 7-point scale agrees would be a moderate left. Someone who strongly disagrees, number 1, would be extreme right. And if he disagrees, 2 or 3, moderate right. And if he's in the middle, would be in the center. So we had a number of questions. No military solution to the conflict. Again, those who, of course, strongly agree, more or less represent the left. To say there's no military solution, you have to reach a political solution. Those who strongly disagree, and by the way, the majority agree, but strongly disagree, there's no military solution, would be, of course, extreme right. And again, you have the middle. No political solution would be the opposite. Do you support a solution for 2 states for 2 peoples? Famous thing. Okay, we have it here. Now you just help me.
All you need to do is,
How do I just go along? Press enter?
yep.
Okay. So you see here we have it. Solution 2 states for 2 people. Don't go. Stand by if you have a minute to help me. If I have a problem. Okay, strongly oppose, strongly support. Again, extreme right, extreme left, of course. And you have in the middle. Then I will just go through quickly. Okay, here we have the remainder of the questions, for instance. Most important value, I'll come to this later. We ask people what's the most important value to them. Greater Israel, preservation of a Jewish majority in Israel, which, as you see right away, the vast majority supports, democracy and peace. 4 values, which all values are part of their value system, which is the most important. Someone who says that greater Israel is the most important, we figured more or less we would put him as extreme right. And here, for instance, giving the Temple Mount to the Palestinians, here it would be left, etc. These are the 15 questions that we had. If anyone has questions about it later, we can go into it. One can argue here or there, but more or less. So we said, okay, we have 11 answers that are the extreme right. That's your first one. We have 8 that's moderate, 8 that's moderate right, moderate left, and 13 answers. You see in the bottom you have a little more. 13 answers that those who answer that represent the extreme left. And then we said, if we have pure types, let's see how many extreme left profiles we have in Israeli society, right? How many extreme right do we have? How many would you think? What percentage? Well, the answer is, to our surprise, none. In other words, in effect, and you hear, look at this thing, and you'll see right away what happens. In Hebrew, we have a saying, en chaya kazot. There's no such creature. If you're talking about a pure type, I'm not asking for much. I'm asking, let's say, the moderate right, extreme right, excuse me, someone who out of 11 questions, which are key questions involved in Israeli debate, out of these 11 questions, did he answer all of them in the way expected from someone in the extreme left? One person out of 724, one person. Let's say, okay, one he missed. Yeah, at least 10 he answered. 6 people, that's less than 1%. By the way, 50%, you can see on the top, 50% didn't answer any of the 11 in the extreme left, or only one out of 11 things. You have the same thing again going in the moderate right. No one answered 8. All 8 of the moderate right. Another one answered 7. Over 50% didn't. Now let's go to the next one and see the left. This, by the way, is for 2006. And for 2007, I show you, you have almost the same thing. Again here, extreme left, you have 0. No one answered all 13 extreme. There's no such profile. As I said, there's no such creature. You have less than 1% answering 12 out of 13. You have 1.5% who answered 11 out of the 13. You go up on top again, 50% didn't answer all or didn't answer 1. If we go further, for the sake of time, this is for 2007. The first one was the numbers 2006. As I said, in INSS, we do this every year, this study. And we ask almost the same questions. Each time we add and change a little. So we can compare over 20 years. Right away, I show an interesting comparison, by the way, about a Palestinian state that Dubi mentioned. So what do you got? The same thing. You see, almost none at, most same answer now. Now let's go quickly further. Okay, the extreme left, you see the same thing. Only one such creature you have who answered all 13. Okay, here's what's important. So we say, okay, we don't have extreme creatures. Let's take those who answered at least half. Okay? At least 7 out of the 6 or 7 out of the 11. 7 out of the 13, which is half. 4 or 5 out of the 8, more or less. I don't want to go in detail. This is what you get. You get 8.8% extreme right, 12.8% moderate right, 18.4% moderate left, 8.4%. That you have 51% in the center. And by the way, the moderate right and the moderate left merge with the center. Don't forget, they're not extreme. They themselves are moderate. Now, if we go forward, we can see here you have the same thing for 2007. And if you paid attention, I didn't go too quickly, you can see a slight shift to the right in 2007 versus 2006, which is clear, which is a result, I think, of Weissler said, mainly in terms of Israeli public opinion, the unmitigated disaster of the results of the disengagement of Gaza, which raised great hopes for the Israeli people, and the results were a total, the word disappointment would be an understatement, and you have a shift to the right. Total disillusionment, by the way, with disengagement, and a great disillusionment with a possibility of reaching agreement with the Palestinians. So you see, but again, again, the center is 50%. What you have is a little more in the right and a little less in the left than you have before. But you still say half of the people, the population, remain in the center. And by the way, just parenthetically, again, because I have another 3, 4, 5 minutes to finish, one of the key factors, by the way, which divide, another important thing, normally the Israeli population is divided by a number of factors. You can have gender, and like in every part, age, origin, Sfardim, Ashkenazim, those from random countries and that. And the concept in Israel was that the political opinion was closely related to this demographic factor. The Sfardim were more hawkish, more suspected of the Arabs. Higher educated were more dovish, etc., more liberal, etc. Older people were more liberal, younger people were less, etc. Well, we checked this out, I'll show you right away. We found that for most of these factors, there is a relationship, but it's not crucial. And contrary, my friends, even this idea of the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide, the Oriental Jews versus the Western Jews, hawkish dovish, is becoming less and less as each year goes on. The only thing where you have a clear difference, a huge difference, is religious identification. But even in the religious group, this is the number one is called the ultra-Orthodox Haredi. Number two is the religious or the Zionist religious. Number three are people who identify themselves as traditionalist religion. 4, those who identify themselves as traditional but more secular. And 5, which doesn't appear here because of a mistake, was 40% who identify themselves as secular. Now what you see here is the religious, there is no left. You see it? 0. For instance, in the ultra-Orthodox, no one entered in the left. In the religious group, we have 6, 7%. But if you count the numbers, even in the religious group, 50% remain in the center. And this is the most important thing, remaining the strength of the center. Here's what I wanted to show you. You see, gender in 2006, age, we took 27 key questions related to political issues, mainly Palestinian issues, Syria, things like that, hawkish versus dovish, mainly, if you put it that way, and saw, was there a significant correlation at the 0-point level, which is a technical term? In other words, is there really a difference? And you see, the only way where you have it serious is religious identification. You have it in the military service, but that is a result of the fact that many of the ultra-Orthodox don't serve, etc. The others are not so crucial. So I think the main feature here is the strength of the Israeli center. Well, this is not important. Let me show you here an interesting thing again, just for those who are interested in public opinion. Here you have, we asked 2 questions. Do you agree or disagree with the establishment of a Palestinian state? And do you support or oppose a 2-state solution? Now, theoretically, it's the same, right? I mean, you can't support a 2-state solution without a Palestinian state. Maybe the Palestinians want a 2-state solution without a Jewish state. But at least in the Israeli public opinion context, if you support a 2-state solution, well, what are the 2 states? One of them at least has to be a Palestinian state. Today we're talking about 3 states already, Gaza, West Bank, etc. If you agree with the establishment of a Palestinian state, then evidently you support certainly from the Jewish point of view, remember we're talking about the Jewish population of Israel, you support a 2-state solution. But when you look at the totals, you see 70% were in favor of a 2-state solution, only 64% were in favor of establishing a Palestinian state. Why? Because, again, you have to have understanding for public opinion, because this term Palestinian state at one time was anathema for the Israeli population. All the Israeli parties, from labor onward, I don't know about Meretz, some of them, but from labor onward, the serious parties, were against the Palestinian state. Until Oslo, when all of a sudden this changed. And therefore, for many Israelis, still the term Palestinian state has a negative connotation relating to security, which is the key issue, as he said. So they're still reticent to say yes, to agree. On the other hand, support for a 2-state solution, that's what everyone is talking about. And Israelis realize that there is no solution except that type of solution, the vast majority, so they're ready to go ahead. And here you see an interesting thing. You see that most of the people, of course, are in the agree, in the column 1-4, right? Column 1-4 is agree, support, disagree, oppose. That's where everyone should be, okay? The 104 and the 32, column 2 and 3, these are somehow different. But you notice that most of the difference are those who disagree with the Palestinian state, nevertheless support support a two-state solution. You only have 32 people out of 700. That's not that much. That really, this is a little hard, doesn't make much sense. They're thinking. One more thing I'd like to show here is, this is not important. Here, again, I think I have 1 or 2 more minutes and I'll finish. I think a key feature, again, of Israeli public opinion is demography has become more important than geography. The importance of the understanding of maintaining Israel as a democratic Jewish state means maintaining a Jewish majority is crucial to Israeli public opinion. The first one, by the way, that understood that was Yitzhak Rabin, who spoke about separation and helped them win the elections in 1992. So we gave them these 4 values that I mentioned before. Look at the results. You have them here for 4 years, and they're quite similar. We asked them which is the most important, second, third, and fourth, because all of them are important. So you see here, a country with a Jewish majority, number 1, almost 50%. It's the first, and if you add the second, you got 70%. Peace and democracy are second and third, and then Greater Israel as the first or second are number 3 or 4, which doesn't mean that Greater Israel is not important to these people. Most of the people have a vast majority, of course, have a great affinity to the land of Israel. But when they have to choose between the values, it's clear where the decision will be. One more thing I'd like to show, I think this will interest you. Support for a Palestinian state, we ask year after year at our INSS project, and look at the results from 97 all the way up. Again, 2007, you have a small drop representing a terrible disappointment, but you still have a majority who today have come to terms with a Palestinian state if it will be in the context of an overall solution, a permanent solution which will guarantee 2 states for 2 peoples, guarantee Israeli security, and guarantee Israel's security state. I'll finish the presentation with this, and I have one more last word to say. Okay, again, you see here, you see the almost half still believe that the Palestinians want peace, interestingly enough, 64, 56, a little low, but you have a difference here more or less. On the other hand, the one I had before that I went through, less than 30% believe today that there's a possibility of reaching a peace agreement. So my last sentence I would say is, finishing these very, very short coverage of Israeli public opinion, there's a whole book that we put out in INSS, myself and a co-worker just in May, and I hope in a month or 2 we'll have a new study in 2008. Israeli public, there's a great deal of flexibility. With a strong government and with a Palestinian leadership, I don't want to exaggerate and say a la Sadat, but which would be able to convince the Israeli public that they are serious in implementing any agreement which will be reached, and in implementing it, and as someone said correctly, controlling the guns and being able to implement it, I think that there is room for far-reaching compromise, readiness upon the Israeli public for far-reaching compromise, but on those 2 conditions. One, that they will be convinced that they have a genuine partner who has come to terms with Israel's existence as a Jewish state and is willing to implement an agreement. And number 2, of course, strong leadership in Israel, which can help in forging this majority. With those 2 conditions, I think there's great flexibility for agreement. If they don't exist, of course, then the prognosis is less positive. Thank you very much.
So what are the political derivatives? What does it all mean for 2008 and 2009? A few interesting derivatives from Yehuda's numbers and Dubi's observations. We have a Israeli political environment is not only complex, which most are, and bizarre for outsiders, but even the terminology is misleading. The territorial divide, if you will, those who support giving up territory for peace and those who used to not support that or oppose it, distorted the entire political system. When we talk about left and right, we don't talk about left and right in the same sense that you or Europeans or others have in mind. For us, left and right is for or against something that has to do with the Palestinians. It's not economic liberalism versus conservatism. It's total distortion of the Israeli political system, encapsulated into one term, left and right, signifying something very, very different from what everybody else in the world understands. Yehuda pointed out the strength of the center and the fact that positions that were the position of the lunatics in the extreme left just 30 years ago are now Israeli mainstream on this issue, and the strength of the center. And that brings me to another division that has to do with the next year. Israelis are not only divided to left and right in that respect, to Jew and non-Jew, to secular and religious. Israelis, by and large, are divided also internally, each person within himself. I like to refer to my mother, 92 years old last week, who has voted labor all her life, who came to Palestine in 1936, supported Ben Gurion, who made the decision on accepting partition with a majority of 1. And yet, whenever violence erupts, there is that extreme rightist that doesn't exist in the polls, does exist inside her stomach, and he jumps out and he determines her political conduct. That is a political reality with tremendous consequences. Yehuda's point before last was that the majority for something went down as a result of a certain disappointment of previous few months. I would like to carry it further. I don't know if Kissinger said what is being attributed to him and is already a mantra. Israel doesn't have foreign policy, only domestic politics. I don't know if he said it. If he said it, I'm not sure he was right then. I would argue that he's definitely wrong today. I would say that Israel doesn't have primarily domestic policy, but Israel has primarily a security policy. What I mean is that Israelis have supported leaders for primarily providing security. And traditionally, and I'm referring only to the last 20, 25 years, traditionally they supported any of 3 alternatives. Give me security by an agreement, and I'll support you. Give me security by breaking their bones, and I'll support you. Give me security by a unilateral act, and I will support you. So they ended up supporting the withdrawal from Lebanon, which was unilateral, and they ended up supporting the withdrawal from Gaza, the disengagement, which was unilateral. With those 2 examples, unilateralism lost its attractiveness. Israelis no longer trust unilateralism.
Because of the results of those
because of the outcome.
Outcome, exactly.
Yep. Some people could say that that outcome could have been predicted, but why argue that point? In any event, Israelis do expect leaders to bring them security, either by agreement or by force, if necessary, and they will support it. And they did support the outbreak of the Second Lebanese War by overwhelming majority.
90%.
They didn't like the way it was handled thereafter. That brings me to an even more extreme position or argument. And I would say that much as Israelis tend to be ignorant of our relevance to intra-Arab dynamics, we're not an objective observer of Arab politics. We are an input into Arab politics. When we behave one way, we provide ammunition to those who support a certain school of thought within the Arab world. When we behave differently, we pull the rug from under them. The same way, the Arabs are not objective observers of the Israeli political reality. They are an input, a very active input into Israeli politics. And I link the 2 points I was making by suggesting that Palestinians elected most of the Israeli prime ministers of the last well over a decade. I would argue that it was violence, Palestinian violence, suicide bombings, that determined the outcome of the Netanyahu versus Peres elections. And when Israelis saw violence, they wanted a tough guy. When White River produced tranquility, and the Palestinian side behaved in a responsible manner, and there was tranquility, Israelis voted for hope and elected Barak by an unprecedented majority. When the Barak hope evaporated into the Intifada chaos, Israelis again went and voted for the tough guy, Arik Sharon. So I'm suggesting